Hello, it's Jim Lynn here, welcome back to my workshop. This is part 3 in my series on the record number 405 MultiPlane, and in this episode we'll be continuing with the SuperTune process, and I'm also hoping to make some first cuts. But to begin with, there's a problem with the skates that I've not yet addressed. Have a look at this. With the plane held upside down, the skates set about 15mm apart, and my winding sticks laid out one at each end, you can see that the skate soles are not coplanar. There's quite a bit of twist. However, as I move the furthest stick towards the closest stick, you can see that the twist reduces. Now, if I balance a square on the furthest point on the left skate, which is the main stock skate, and so the reference skate, we can see that the sliding section skate on the right doesn't reach the square. And again, as we move the square rearwards, the deviation reduces. Finally, at the very rear, both skates are square to each other. Here I've set a cutter in the main stock, and with the cutter side flush to the main stock working side, this shot confirms that the cutter edge is square to that main stock working side. Could it be a problem with the rods? Are they twisted relative to each other? Well, using the winding sticks across the rods, I found that there is a very slight discrepancy, but it's tiny. I can't imagine that having such a big effect. So then I put one winding stick across the rods where they emerge from the body, and I checked the rods against the main stock sole. They're absolutely spot on. So I think the rods are okay. I tried the winding sticks check with the main stock only, so the sliding section removed, just so I have a complete set of data. Now here there's also very slight twist, but in the opposite sense. This is what it all boils down to. There's an issue with either design or manufacturing causing this mismatch towards the front of the skates. Now our testing has shown that the problem isn't with the rods or the way they're rigged, so a solution won't involve those. So a resolution has to come from removing metal from one of the skates. The front end of the main stock skate is the highest point, so I'm going to remove the heaviest amount of metal from there and taper to nothing at all at the rear end here. So here's the setup. I've got some 240 grit paper stuck to my reference plate, and I'm making some marks on the side of the skate. This is to give me a repeatable visual reference for the taper grind. I start off the paper and move forward to the first mark, keeping all the downward pressure at the front. In hindsight, I should have stuck an upside down piece of 240 grit paper before the abrasive section to make that start transition easier. I start off the paper each time and move forward one more mark each time, eventually stopping at the last pen mark, so removing nothing from the rear end. Then I just repeat until the work is done. Here I'm using the small square to check progress at the front end. That's the result we're looking for. I'll also do a quick check at the rear just to make sure there's no issues crept in there. Now this whole process didn't take long at all. Bear in mind that the total surface area we're working on is tiny, so be careful not to work too long before checking. Now there's always the chance of a crown or a hollow appearing along the length of the skates, so here I'm marking them up for telltale, and I make a few passes just to make sure, being careful not to tip the tool. So did it work? Well, I think it did. As you can see as I move the square along each of the 7 positions, I'm confident that these two skates are now square to each other. Of course, this is only absolutely true for this particular spacing on the rods, but this spacing is not going to be far from all the possible spacings. So I think any difference for individual cutters is going to be negligible. I think this task was important and was worth doing. It means that the tool will now register properly on the work, and that means we're more likely to get a good result. Now the heart of every plane is obviously the cutter or blade, and to keep things simple I'm going to be using this 5/8 of an inch blade. That's roughly 15.875mm. In a previous episode, I flattened and smoothed the front and the back and both sides of all the cutters, And I finished them off by using these abrasive pads. Now this is the medium and this is the fine, and that just gave a nice bright finish to all the cutters. Obviously the cutters need to be sharp, so I thought I'd have a look at what advice the little manual gave on sharpening the cutters. This is what it had to say. This is from section 14 called Sharpening the Cutters, and it says no plane will give good service if the cutter is not sharp. That's pretty obvious. The plough and tonguing cutters offer no difficulty, the method of sharpening being exactly the same as with any other plane blade. Good to know. It says they should not be allowed to get thick, and that's in inverted commas, but ground on the stone often enough. Many workers keep a single bevel, and for fine work this is a good plan. So I thought I'd keep to that advice and just use one main bevel for grinding. That's the primary bevel, and normally you'd have a secondary bevel a little bit steeper, but if I keep all my sharpening to that bevel it'll make things a lot simpler. I think I'll still use my micro bevel though, and on the back I'll finish off with David's ruler trick. Now I'm not going to spend too long showing you how to sharpen these cutters. You've seen me do that many times, and anyway you can use your own method. But there's a point I'd like to make, and it's to do with the bedding angle. That is the angle that the blade is set into the main stock. That's quite interesting. Have a look at this. This picture shows that the bedding angle is 40 degrees off the vertical, which is 50 degrees off the work. Now this is known as York pitch, and it helps with reducing tear out. But it does give us some options for our primary bevel, in that if the edge doesn't last, we could try a higher angle of grind to see if that makes the edge more robust. For now though, I'll just start with the bevel angle as it is. So what is that bevel angle? This clip shows that the current bevel angle is a little bit more than 30 degrees, but less than 35 degrees, so roughly 33 degrees or so. So I'm going to use the red high angle setting on my honing guide, but use the yellow standard angle 25 degree position on the angle registration jig to give me that 33 degree grind angle. I started off on my 140 grit diamond plate. All I'm really doing here is resetting the angle of the primary bevel to match that of my own equipment, and so took the grind right through to the edge. I'm also making sure that the primary bevel is nice and fresh. Then it was just a simple matter of working my way up through the 1000 grit stone and then the 4000 grit stone. At this point I changed the micro bevel knob to the 6 o'clock position and then honed a little micro bevel on my 10,000 grit stone. Finally, I finished off with David's ruler trick on the back side of the blade. That doesn't look too bad. These are tungsten steel cutters, so they should hold an edge okay, but they might be brittle, so I'll just need to be a wee bit careful. Cuts this cherry nicely. Right, let's set this up for working a rebate along the grain. I'm starting with the cutter. Hook the notch in the cutter over the pin in the depth adjuster. Seat the cutter in the bed so that one side protrudes slightly beyond the skate working surface. Then tighten the wing nut just enough to hold it for now. Take a little straight edge and flush the side with the skate. Then we can tighten the wing nut. Next, I'm setting the main depth gauge to a reasonable setting. Note here that I'm making sure the top of the nut flange bears on the upper surface in the notch in the stock. This will stop slippage. Now we can tighten the lock screw. Set and secure the rods. Push on the sliding section. This is a good tight fit under the cutter. Note where I've set the sole relative to the cutter. Together with the main stock sole, this will provide a good bearing surface as the cut proceeds. Now I can set the fence in position. For demonstration purposes, I'm just choosing a setting that is within the width of the cutter. If I needed to, I could use the micro adjuster to fine-tune that width of cut. So here's the setup. The width of cut is defined by the distance between the working surface of the main stock and the side of the fence. As I said previously, the sliding section in this situation is just providing support. The best position for it is actually quite close to the fence. This is an overview of the setup I'm using. I found a nice piece of cedar and I smoothed the upper surface and one side and made sure they were square to each other, and I'm holding it securely with my holdfasts, making sure I've got clearance for the plane. The blue weight is just to hold the plane in position for recording purposes. This view shows that both skates are fully engaged on the work. I've marked the edge with a Sharpie to make it clearer. And in this view, you can see that the left-hand edge of the cutter overhangs the edge of the work, as we're going to be cutting a rebate. Well, this was a big disappointment. I was expecting easy, whisper-thin shavings right from the beginning, but this was just horrible. For a start, adjustment of the depth of cut went from 0 to too much in a fraction of a turn of the adjusting knob, and there was just far too much effort required to push the plane through the wood. As if the blade was blunt, but I know I sharpened that really well. And in fact, sometimes the whole thing would just jam in the cut. And also I can definitely feel it chattering, so something isn't right. Here we can see those chatter marks. Chattering is normally caused by a cutter that isn't well supported by the bed of the plane. So as you push the plane, the cutter gets forced into the bed, causing the cutter to dig in. Then, as the wood breaks free, the cutter springs back, and then the cycle repeats itself many times per second, causing these marks. In fact, this is what I found. This clip clearly shows a gap between the cutter and the bed. Now, it crossed my mind that I might have caused this myself when I was attempting to make both cutter beds coplanar. But whatever the reason, what's the solution? Well, I can think of various solutions that would involve varying levels of work, but I wanted something simple that I can do right away to see if I can eliminate this chatter. This clip shows that there's a little gap at the top of the cutter that I think I can make use of. I measured the gap with my thickness gauges and found it to be 0.38 millimeters, so I cut a piece off that thickness gauge and slotted it under the top of the cutter. This did the trick. In this clip, you can see that the gap is now closed. Did it work? Well, it did actually. The chatter has been eliminated, but the plane doesn't feel easy, and it definitely should take a light cut and be silky in operation. Also, the cut isn't square. This is a view from the front, out of square is quite obvious here. Less so at the back though. The side of the rebate isn't too bad at the back, but it's not so good at the front with a false start here, but that's most likely due to the earlier difficulties. Well, you can't expect every project to go according to plan, but I still think we can get this plane performing a lot better than it is at the moment. And if I can't, I'll have an attractive tool-like ornament. Thank you very much for watching everyone, and I'll see you next time on Mr. Lynn's Workshop.